Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome to week 3 of the Book of Lost Tales class. First off, yes, thank you. Several people have been asking already. Yes, my voice is significantly better this week. I'm not 100% over my cold, but it's nothing but barely lingering. So yeah, I hope that I'll be in a little bit better shape this week than last week as far as my voice is concerned. Yana's accusing me of transmitting my cold to him. Possibly, Yana. I'm not quite sure how that would happen, but I can't rule it out. But yes, Patrick is hoping that everybody took their antidepressants and has a nice comforting cup of tea ready for our 2-week discussion of Turambar here. Though I have to say, actually, I don't find this version of the story nearly as soul-crushingly depressing as I find the Silmarillion version. But we'll see. I mean, we'll get there. Anyway, first of all, I wanted to apologize. I'm sorry I'm a little behind the 8 ball tonight. Getting started a bit late and everything. Even later than usual. Because this week is vacation week. It's winter break here. Schools are on vacation in New Hampshire this week. And I have been taking my family places. They've been skiing. I don't myself ski, but my children do. So we've been taking our kids skiing. And I just, got back in the door 10 minutes before class started tonight. So I'm still kind of dashing about. Spent most of my day in a ski lodge. We'll be all right. But anyway, I just wanted to apologize for, as I say, being a little bit late and scattered here this evening. I also want to announce, before we get going, or not announce, remind, really, update the Lord of the Rings Marathon this weekend. It's only a couple days away. We still have seats available. It would be really cool. Anybody who is in the region, I strongly urge you to come. Brandon Young is here. Excellent. Yes, I saw you're coming, Brandon. That's so cool. It's going to be a lot of fun. And the weather looks awesome. I know a lot of people were worried about the weather in Boston. Yes, the snowbanks are really high, but it's not snowed for days now. The roads are dry. It's perfect. Wonderful conditions. Supposed to be sunny and nice and warm, up in the 20s on Saturday. So it's going to be great. Definitely, if you can possibly make it, I urge you to. So that's, again, this coming Saturday, the 28th of February, in Arlington, Massachusetts. It will be a great time. But anyway, let's talk about Turambar and the Foaloke. So, as before, with this story, I mean, really with all of these stories, especially these. These are the first 3 stories that we get in this volume: the story of Tinuviel, the story of Turambar, and the story of the fall of Gondolin. Are the 3 that we're going to be really coming back. I mean, we will in the story of the Naglafring as well, but that story, the story of the Naglafring, is altered so much more radically than these others. I would say that. I don't think we're going to be quite as tempted to be sort of putting the later Silmarillion version of the story, next to this version and be sort of continually comparing and contrasting. So I would, but again, for these first 3, that's something that we're going to be very conscious of and that we're always going to be doing. And I want to, just kind of reframe ourselves like when we were talking about the Tinuviel story. On the one hand, I don't, desire to resist the comparison and contrast. It's inescapable and it's healthy, but I also don't want to get fixated on just noticing differences, right? On just thinking about how this story is not the Silmarillion version of the story. Instead, I want to see if we can, at times at least, sort of free ourselves from that version. Forget about the Silmarillion version enough to really take this version of the story on its own ground, and see what really comes from it. I already made reference to the fact, Patrick was joking about the antidepressants, and I know I always feel the same way. Patrick, I'll never forget the first time I taught my undergraduate Tolkien class. I was so excited. It was the first time I'd ever taught Tolkien, and I started the class with the Silmarillion, and I remember I read the Turin story twice, like back to back. I read it and then I started and read it again. So I'm like, I want it all to be like super fresh. I want to make sure I have the whole thing really fresh in my mind. And I was just like, I went into class that first day and I was like, hey everybody. It was like this weight of grief on me and I'm like, I am never ever doing that again. Anyway, as I mentioned, I don't find that same kind of effect with this version of the story, and I don't know. I'll be interested to hear, as I said, what you guys have to say about that. As we go through this story, to see if you agree with me. If that's just some kind of arbitrary impression based on the circumstances in which I'm reading this version this time, or whether there's really some substance there. I think that the character of Túrin is very significantly different, and I do think that this first version of the story has some qualities to it which are not there. And again, I'm using that word in the same way that I was when we were talking about the Tunuvial story as well. It has some elements. It has some flavors that the later Turambar story doesn't have, and vice versa. So I want to try to identify that. I want to try to figure out what kind of story is this, and how does it fit? How does it fit into the Book of Lost Tales as a whole? Because I think that this is a story which is even more remarkable in the context of the Book of Lost Tales than it is in the context of the Silmarillion for being a human-centered story. It's already pretty remarkable that way in the Silmarillion. We've had men involved in stories, and we've sort of lingered on them for important moments. I'm talking about in the published Silmarillion now. Men have been involved and have done lots of things, but the story of Túrin Turambar is really the only story in the entire Silmarillion which is focused on men. There are elf characters, of course, in it, most notably Beleg, and we've got the whole Thingol and Melian portion of the story, but in Oradreth, it's not that there aren't elves, but it really is a story primarily about people. It focuses from beginning to end on Túrin much more exclusively than obviously than the Baron and Luthien story focuses on Baron. But notice again, this is another impact of the change that Tolkien made in Baron's race, right? By making Baron an elf, it makes the Turambar story stand out even more. Now, this is really the first significant story we've got about humans at all in the entire Book of Lost Tales. So that, I think, is a remarkable thing. And in light of that, let's look at how we're introduced to this. Again, one of the things that we get in the Book of Lost Tales, which really separates it from really every version of the story that comes out, every version of these stories that come after it, is the frame narrative, right? The whole aerial plot and the tellers of the story that he gives these stories to, and those of you who took my Chaucer class, my Canterbury Tales class, will remember the sort of fun we had thinking about how Chaucer employs his frame tale to sort of add these extra layers of story, right? These extra dimensions to the poems and the stories that he's telling by framing them in the voice of a particular teller who has his or her own individual interests and personality and relationship with the story. Now, we don't get anything nearly as elaborate, of course, as the Canterbury Tales frame in the Book of Lost Tales, but it's sort of a step in that direction. I think, for instance, even more significantly, I think, with the next story, with the fall of Gondolin and the introduction we get to the narrator in that story. But I want to look at the frame that we get before the Turin story, because this one I think is really interesting. Now, all folk gathered here know that this is the story. This is Eltas, the person. I say person because his race is a little bit uncertain. At least he's not introduced as a man, though he seems to be one. But anyway, now all folk gathered here know that this is the story of Turambar and the Foaloke, and it is, said he, a favourite tale among men, and tells of very ancient days of that folk, before the battle of Tessarinan, when first men entered the dark vales of Hisalome. In these days many such stories do men tell still, and more have they told in the past, especially in those kingdoms of the north that once I knew. Maybe the deeds of other of their warriors have become mingled therein, and many matters beside that are not in the most ancient tale. But now I will tell to you the true and lamentable tale, and I knew it long ere I trod Olore Male in the days before the fall of Gondolin. Okay, Yana just asked the $50 question. How could he be an adult man in the Lonely Isle? I don't know, Yana. That's what's so peculiar. And remember, in the commentary, Christopher Tolkien points this out too, and says he really wishes his father had given a little bit more detail about this teller, because it's a peculiar sort of thing. He seems to be human, not an elf, the teller. And that seems to be pretty clear because of the context in that second paragraph. In these days, many such stories do men tell still, and more have they told, especially in those kingdoms of the north that once I knew. It sounds like he's in that human culture, but more importantly, I knew it long ere I trod Olore Male in the days before the fall of Gondolin. And the Olore Male is something we learned about in Book of Lost Tales Part 1, you may remember, and that is the Path of Dreams. It is the magical path connecting the world of men to Elvenhome, which human children can travel in their dreams. It's the Path of Dreams. And remember, the teller, our previous teller, Veyane, the teller of the Tinuviel story, said that she once saw Tinuviel and Gwendolen. She saw Tinuviel and her mom when she had traveled the Olore Male. So we had another reference to that then. So she once on the Dream Road saw Tinuviel and her divine mother. Human children specifically, tread the Olore Male, so it seems pretty clear that this kid is human. We know that there are human children there in the Lonely Isle there, in the house. But he sure doesn't sound like a child. Maybe, Nick says, was he one of the children from the House of Lost Play? The time frame is really difficult to understand. I knew it long ere I trod Olore Male in the days before the fall of Gondolin. How old is he? How long ago was this? I mean, it's I don't know. I don't know how to answer this. It's the information that we get on this teller is very tantalizing, but it's really kind of unclear, and I don't really know what was in his mind here. But the one thing that does seem pretty clear is whatever else the explanation of the way this presumably juvenile teller is introducing this story, or is sort of reflecting back on his own life. At the very least, he seems clearly to be human, just again based on the fact that he has trodden the Olore Male. So we get an emphatically human teller of this emphatically human tale. what else do you notice in this passage? What else strikes you as interesting in here? One thing that I would point out from the beginning is that this is a favorite tale among men. It was something that I remember from, I was going to say the first time I read the Silmarillion, I should say more accurately the first time I successfully read the Silmarillion, being almost a little perplexed. As you go through, what a confession, right? First time I read the Silmarillion, I was a little perplexed. No. What I mean is specifically with the long stories, right? Both in the published Silmarillion, both the story of Beren and Luthien and the story of Túrin Turambar get they're introduced with this. They're sort of flagged as the longest tales, right? You could tell that by the table of contents if you looked carefully. But at the beginning of those, we're reminded, right? This is the longest tale save one. It says at the beginning of the story of Beren and Luthien, and then this is the tale of the children of Hurin is the longest tale of all, and. It's not that length equals greatness, in any kind of simple way, but nevertheless, it's hard not to be paying special attention to these tales, right? It's not to feel like some special distinction is being placed upon them by them, being singled out that this is the longest and the second longest of all the stories. And with the Beren and Luthien story, that always made sense. It's obviously really important, right? Not only is the story a story of really kind of the greatest and most heroic events that happen, at least as great as anything else that happens in the Silmarillion, the story of Túrin Turambar, not so much, right? And again, here I was also influenced by the fact that I knew the Lord of the Rings quite well when I read the Silmarillion for the first time, since I didn't get through it till I was older, and I remembered the references to Túrin in The Lord of the Rings, right? So I came to the story with high expectations, because I've been told that Túrin was listed as among those foremost elf friends that Elrond lists at the end of the Council of Elrond, saying that Frodo's name would be among the greatest of all the elf friends, including Beren and Hurin and Túrin. With that introduction, it's the longest of all the tales. With the fact that Túrin was cited twice in the Lord of the Rings as being one of the greatest of the greats, I was ready for the most heroic story of all, and I was kind of surprised and appalled by what I actually found when I read the story of Túrin Turambar. And again, this is circling back around to that first paragraph here in the Book of Lost Tales version. Why is it a favorite tale? It's obvious that it's one of Tolkien's favorite tales in the number of times he retold and reworked this story. He obviously loved it. But how are we supposed... But I'm not interested in that so much. What I'm interested in is why? What are we supposed to understand? Why within his secondary world are we to understand that this is a favorite story? What makes it a favorite of the guy who's telling this? Kay says, after all my build-up to Túrin, she says, and then Túrin himself happens, right? Yeah, and then Túrin bumbles his way through his own story. Yeah. Sarah King is wondering if perhaps it's a favorite tale among men. She's wondering if perhaps that was a typo, and Tolkien meant a favorite tale among marsh wiggles instead. I do think that that Puddleglum would really enjoy the Túrin Turambar story. In fact, Sarah, I think it would be really funny to have that as kind of like an Easter egg. If I were doing like an illustration of the silver chair, to have Puddleglum, reading or carrying around a copy of the Narn, his favorite bedtime reading. But anyway, okay. But no, more seriously, Karita is suggesting that stories about dragons and men are still favorite tales among humans. Yes, that's true, though. They usually end better than this one does. The majority, I would say, I think it's fair to say that the majority of heroic dragon slaying tales that are popular among humans contain less incest and fewer suicides than this story does, on average, anyway. But again, what is it? What is it with this story? And in a sense, we kind of touched on this a little bit last time too, thinking about the ending of the Baron and Tinuviel story, and the way in which the kind of triumphant epic conclusion of the story, that is the final and ultimate sacrifice that Luthien makes for Baron, not being there because unnecessary, because Baron's an elf, and the change in fate that Baron and Tinuviel experience at the end of the tale, in like version C, right, of the ending, is not about sacrifice and sort of the final and ultimate statement of their love and commitment to each other, but rather just a consequence that's meted out to them in order to make sure that they understand that they're not getting a completely happily ever after story, right? Mandos makes that pretty clear, right? I'll send you back, but don't think I'm getting soft, right? Don't think I'm just trying to make you happy, because that's not what this is about. But anyway, doesn't it almost sounds at times, in that ending, like Mandos is trying to be like, don't let it get around that I'm getting soft. I don't want to damage my hardcore reputation here as God of the Dead. But anyway, I nevertheless, like, the sadness of that story, right? The lack of a triumphant or even a triumphal happy ending at the end of the Baron and Tinuviel story is a really interesting choice. And in this one, this is a much sadder story, and yet it too seems to be powerful. It too is important, and is really valued. Why? In some ways, it even has it's even singled out less for that in here than it is in the published Silmarillion. The business about the grave of the hapless and the their island and stuff afterwards is even more striking. But we'll come back, of course, to the ending of this story here. But anyway, I want to look at a few more of your observations here. Yeah, good. As Yana says, why is it a favorite tale among men? Because they really don't come across well in this story. Yeah, it's not that like the race of man as a whole comes off looking terrible in this story necessarily, but yeah, it's not like it's not exactly like good propaganda either. It's not like you would say, hey, if you're talking to a skeptical elf, right, who thinks that humans aren't worth anything, it's not like you'd be like, whoa, read the Túrin Turambar story, and that'll answer all your questions about that, right? In that sense, Yana, it's not like it's... again, the Baron and Luthien story, the later Baron and Luthien story, would do that. In fact, that is exactly the role that it plays within the published Silmarillion, right, where Thingol's like, hey, look at Baron, I guess men aren't so bad after all, right? Hard to see the story of Turin by itself having that kind of effect. Okay, let's see. Yeah, good. Let's see. A lot of a couple people are pointing out that about the business about other stories being mixed up with this one. That's sort of a kind of a classic sort of Tolkien reference, right? As the teller of this story, again in a very non-childlike way, is going back and trying and saying, like, this legend has been mingled with other legends over the years, right? So that many times when you hear the story of Turin, what you're really hearing is like a greatest hits of the heroic past, things which have been attached to him that really are the deeds of other warriors. But now, he says, I will tell to you the true and lamentable tale. I almost wonder if he's specifying both, right? That is to say, the version of the story you normally hear is both less true and less lamentable than the true story, right? The other story is a little more cheerful. I'm going to tell you the real story, which is deeply lamentable. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, just scanning through some of the other comments here. Yeah, good. Nancy Fosberg says, in this version of the story, even Urin is a jerk. We'll come to that, Nancy, next time when we look at the end of the story. We'll look at Urin and how Urin is depicted, especially in his dealings with Tynwellint at the end. Okay, let's see. Good. Yeah, Josh Evans points out, it's a dark and terrible time for humans. In many ways, this is, it's a true version. It's a true story to the times, and to as somebody else earlier, who was talking. Oh yeah, Brandon was talking about how it's sort of indicative of all human folly, right? That to be, to some extent, to be, there is a way in which Baron, the later story of Baron, the story of Baron the human hero, might be one which sort of elevates humanity, right? He sort of shows what humanity at its heroic apex is capable of. Turin instead shows what people mostly do, right? It doesn't show humanity at its worst, but shows more what people are kind of like, and so in that way is a more true, is sort of more true to humanity than other stories. Tom, I think this is a really important thing. Tom Hillman says it addresses head on, not that it answers, the problem of death and fate that men see themselves facing. Think of Andreth, the cheerful wise woman. Yeah, of course, Tom is being sarcastic here. She's not extremely cheerful, but absolutely. This is a story which does, I think, wrestle much more directly with what it means to be human, both in the sense of, Brandon, as you were suggesting, the kind of folly that Turin shows, and how flawed he is and how much he screws up. In that way, Turin, although we might not like to think so, represents us better than Baron does as humans, right? Again, the later Baron I'm talking about. But it's not only is that true, but as Tom suggests, it really depicts the human situation, not just in giving us a character to relate to in that way, or one who sort of demonstrates our own follies and our own weakness, but the challenges that we as mortals face, death and fate, both. I agree, Tom. In that question, what was Turin's situation? Does Turin deserve what happens to him, or does he just get the shaft? How much free will does he have? How much does he shape his own fate? Is he in fact Turambar, master of his own fate, or is he not? Is that completely empty? Is he just a victim? And Tom, you're right, it doesn't really answer that question, but it asks that question really emphatically. And that does seem to be, thinking back, Tom, as you suggest, to Andreth, the cheerful wise woman, that question of what is the situation of human beings, in fact? Where are we? What exactly are we facing? And what can we expect? It's one of the subjects of the debate between Andreth and Finrod in the Athrobeth this is the references here, of course I should explain for people who are not familiar with it, is with that wonderful short story that Tolkien wrote in Morgoth's Ring. It was published in Morgoth's Ring by Christopher Tolkien, Volume 10 of the History of Middle-earth, and it's called the Athrobeth, or the debate between Finrod and Andreth, Andreth being a wise woman, and Finrod, of course, meaning Finrod Felagund. So it's a debate between the two of them, and one of the main things that's at issue, especially in the first third of that debate, is the question of, like, to what extent has mankind simply been hosed? You know, like, they've been doomed to death. Has man been screwed over, or do they deserve it? Right? Andreth is essentially arguing that mankind has been screwed over and just dealt a bad hand, and it's not their fault, and they can't do anything about it. And Finrod suspecting that they kind of did deserve it, and it's probably actually their fault. Anyhow, there's a lot that we can look at, and this is some of the stuff that I really want to focus on as we look at the story itself. I still think it's interesting that it's a favorite tale, right? That's a really interesting word to me, because he doesn't say the most moving tale told among men, right? Nor like tale which, though it may be unpleasant to listen to, is extremely important to heed, right? Or raises these really critical issues. It's the favorite tale, right? It's the tale they want to hear again and again. Why do they? Well, anyway, I don't expect to answer this question in the first paragraph, but I think it's an important question to be keeping in mind as we go through. Just like keep reminding yourself as we're talking about this story, this is a favorite tale among men. Yeah, good. Anyway, okay. Let's. There's a bunch of people have been making comments. I want to make sure. I want to move on. If one of the comments you guys had made in the last 3 or 4 minutes comes up again, please feel free to post it again. I know I'm not seeing all of them right here, but let's move ahead and start looking at the content of the story. And I want to start off with this issue of Turin and his destiny, right? We see him being cursed by Melko, right? Melko has taken Hurin, and Hurin has stood up to him, and Melko curses his kin and sentences Hurin to watch as he makes his son's life into a torment. So we already know in this, as in all of the versions of the Turin story, we know before Turin's story itself begins that Melko is setting out to make his life a torment. So let's look at this initial description, which and again, this is not at the very beginning. This is during his time in I almost said in Doriath, in Artenor, with Tynwelint. But I find this really interesting. Thus came to pass the dwelling of Turin in the halls of Tynwelint, and with him was suffered to dwell Gumlin the aged, who had fared with him out of Hithlum, and had no heart or strength for the returning. Very much joy had he in that sojourn, yet did the sorrow of his sundering from Mavwen never quite away from him. Great waxed his strength of body, and the stoutness of his feats got him praise, wheresoever Tynwelint was held as lord. Yet he was a silent boy, and often gloomy, and he got not love easily, and fortune did not follow him, for few things that he desired greatly came to him, and many things at which he laboured went awry. For nothing, however, did he grieve so much as the ceasing of all messengers between Mavwen and himself, when, after a few years, as has been told, the hills became untraversable, and the ways were shut. Now Turin was 7 years old when he fared to the woodland elves, and 7 years he dwelt there, while tidings came ever and anon to him from his mother, so that he heard how his sister Nianori grew to a slender maid and very fair, and how things grew better in Hithlum, and his mother more in peace. And then all words ceased, and the years passed. What do you see here? What do you see as significant as his, in this description of Turin's life? Right? Trying to think about thinking about sort of the sort of frame, because in a sense I see this as another, almost like a framing passage, not a frame for the story as a whole in the same way as the first one, of course, but as a frame for the story of Turin's actions, because we haven't yet gotten any of Turin's own actions. He didn't choose to leave his home, to leave his mother and to come to the court of Tynwellant. His mother made that decision, and he had to go along with it. We're told that he's doing things, that he is doing stout feats, apparently. Stout feats are being accomplished, but we don't know what they are. None of those are being listed. The first event of the story, the first action that Turin performs is, when he smashes the elf's face with his drinking vessel. This paragraph is the lead-in to the story of the first thing that we see him doing. So again, we're given a kind of a context here, trying to understand Turin's mindset, his mood, to use that word in the archaic sense in which Tolkien so often uses it. Tolkien, of course, thinking of the Anglo-Saxon word "mode," which was I was about to say a complex word. By that, really, I just mean a word which does not have any single equivalent in modern English. Certainly, the modern word "mood" is a pale shadow of the old word. It kind of means mind, but it kind of means more like frame of mind. But it also has that sense of emotion to it, which we do still, which meaning still kind of lingers in the modern word "mood." It also means like your spirit, your if you have great mode, you might, it's like greatly daring, a great gumption, Anyway. So we're learning something of his mood. We're learning something of his spirit. We're learning something of his life here to contextualize his actions. And what do we learn? Giannis says the description of Nianore seems creepy in hindsight. Yes, a little bit. Yes, I hear that. Arthur was saying that too. Turin, stop thinking about your pretty sister. Yeah, Arthur, that could grow into an unfortunate habit, couldn't it? But Carita, I agree with you. I find this description of Turin very pitiable. That he got not love easily. It is. I mean, Nancy is sort of joking about him being a like a sulky teenager. And yeah, he does seem like kind of a sulky teenager, but it's that's what I think is important about this passage, is that rather than sort of seeing him from without, right, that is looking on Turin and seeing him, in how others would see him, we're given here a glimpse of his own perspective, right, of his own outlook, and I agree with Carita, that line. That he got not love easily, is pitiable. I mean, he's a silent boy and often gloomy, and he got not love easily, and fortune did not follow him. For few things that he desired greatly came to him, and many things at which he labored went awry. It does sort of suggest, we can see his desire for things, his desire which are thwarted, and his laboring for things which labor goes awry, and the end which he is trying to achieve slips through his fingers. And by implication, at least the implication that I take from he got not love easily, you could read that relatively callously as he was an unlikable kid. Right, nobody really liked him because he was silent and gloomy and depressing and sullen, maybe, and you can read it that way. But again, especially in the context of few things that he desired greatly came to him, right, implies to me that he wanted love, but didn't get it easily, right? And especially in the overall context of his separation from his mother, right? Whom we know that he loves, and whom we know that he is. So here he is alone, cared for, cherished even in the court of the Elven King, and yet, he doesn't get love easily, and that's sad. Sarah King says, she's inclined to think it's significant that he can't make things, that the work of his hands doesn't bear fruit. The things at which he labored went awry. And that's interesting, Sarah. I hadn't really thought of it like that. I mean, I don't necessarily think that we have to interpret that in terms of actual, craftsmanship, that he's actually, that the things at which he's laboring are necessarily like stuff that he's making. It may mean that sort of more abstractly. But nevertheless, I agree that there is a significance in the fact that, the things that he tries to make fail. And we're told that, before we see him making some of his rather unfortunate decision. My subtitle for this passage, I called it Turin's unhappiness. And I did that mostly sort of making a pun on that second word. Because, of course, it is unhappy. We see that his childhood is an unhappy childhood, separated from his mother, and we see some of these circumstances which led to his unhappiness. But it's also unhappy in a more literal sense. The word happy, comes from the word hap in Middle English, an Old English word, the same word exactly, Tom, that hapless comes from. Hap just means luck. In Middle English, you can still people say things like "have good hap," or "I wish you good hap." It just means luck, talking about his unhappiness, meaning. And by the way, I think that's how Tolkien used that word. Like, if you think of that line, that wonderful sentence in the Silmarillion that describes human beings, the race of men in Middle-earth, like the end of the First Age and in the Second Age, where it says, "And the lot of men was unhappy." Remember that sentence? I believe Tolkien means that in the old sense. That is, that they were unlucky. They were unfortunate. They were, not like they were all, gloomy and kind of depressive, right? But rather, they were out of luck. Life was tough for them, and life was tough for Túrin in this way as well. Yeah. Yeah, good. Arthur points out that we see Túrin's abandonment issues much more prominently than we do in the later story. Yes, I agree. I think there is much more focus here. And again, notice I'm trying, Arthur, I'm trying to do both, right? On the one hand, as you are very appropriately noticing that difference between this version and the later version, but now, having noticed that, now let's put the later version aside. What we see here is this story, the beginning of this story, is much more emphatically the story of an essentially an orphaned boy, right? I do think that element is a much more important element in this story, and we will move on. Yeah, Karita says Túrin is very hapless in this story. I agree. Look what happens when he does finally make his first bad call, right? When he does his first ill deed in the slaying of Orgoth. That, of course, is a very striking element in the story. We recognize the haughty elf who taunts Túrin for his being unkempt. And I hope you enjoyed Tolkien's use of the opposite of that, actually using the word kempt. Again, that's another old, classic word, kempt, in Middle English. Middle English just meant combed. You comb in the present tense, and it has been kempt in the past. That's the past participle. So, anyway. You've got Orgoff speculating that the women of Hithlum are go about unkempt, and then Túrin throwing his drinking vessel into the and smashing the face of Orgoff, which we expect, but then we see Orgoff in fact being stricken dead by that blow, which comes as a bit of a surprise when we're coming from the Silmarillion perspective. What do you make of this? What do you make of that? What do you make of that incident? How did that incident strike? And this is really the first action, the first scene of Túrin that we get, other than this kind of overview that we're getting of his earlier life. This is really kind of the first incident of his adult career here. Orgoff had it coming. Well, yeah, that's what the court decided, right? When Tynwelyn said it. He doesn't exactly say it that way, but that's pretty much, what he decides. He finds Túrin guilty. It's like, he basically lets him off of the manslaughter conviction because Orgoff had it coming, right? That's pretty much what everybody agrees. Yeah, look at his reaction. Oh, hang on. Before we look at his reaction here, I want to touch briefly on the point that Tom made, because it is an important one. Tom is reminding us that Túrin still did find very much joy in Doriath, which he doesn't. We don't get those references in the later story. We know he's becoming famous. We understand, at least Beleg leads us to understand in the Silmarillion version, that he and Túrin were happy, together as comrades out on the marches. But we don't get that sense of joy. And Tom, I do think that's important. We see him being unhappy. We see him not getting love easily. We see him being desolate in his separation from his mother, and all that seems to mean to him, but he's not miserable in Doriath. He does find joy there. And that, I think, is really poignant then when we look at his reaction to this killing he's just accidentally done. Well, like, it was an accident in the sense that he didn't mean to kill him, right? I just meant to break his mouth. I didn't mean to kill him. Then all men rose in silence, but Túrin, gazing aghast upon the body of Orgoff and the spilled wine upon his hand, turned on his heel and strode into the night. And some that were akin to Orgoff drew their weapons half from their sheaths, yet none struck, for the king gave no sign, but stared stonily upon the body of Orgoff, and very great amaze was in his face. But Túrin laved his hands in the stream without the doors, and burst there into tears, saying, Lo, is there a curse upon me? For all I do is ill. And now is it so turned that I must flee the house of my foster-father, an outlaw guilty of blood, nor look upon the faces of any I love again. And in his heart he dared not return to Hithlum, lest his mother be bitterly grieved at his disgrace, or perchance he might draw the wrath of the elves behind him to his folk. Wherefore he got himself far away, and when men came to seek him, he might not be found. How awful is this? The tears of Túrin, right? One of the things I find so striking here, in the whole Doriath sequence, in the Cyros, with the whole Cyros incident and everything in the later versions of the story, Cyros had it coming. I don't feel bad for Cyros. I find Túrin kind of understandable and everything. I'm not against him, but I don't find it moving. I don't feel inclined to weep for Turin in those scenes in the later version of the story. But this is so sad. Is there a curse on me? For all I do is ill. I mean, I lost my temper and threw my cup at the guy's face and it killed him, right? And now because like the guy, I accidentally threw the thing too hard and the guy died. Now like I must flee the house of my foster father, right? So okay, I mean, just notice the weight on all of these phrases. I must flee the house of my foster father. The one place that I have found joy. Even though I'm still, I feel alone and cut off, yet at least I've been fostered and have found some love here and have found joy. But now, it's not about the king, it's not about the court, it's not about, it's about the house of his foster father, right? And now I have to leave an outlaw guilty of blood, right? I killed a guy and now I've got to go. So not only am I losing my foster father and his entire house, I'm leaving in disgrace, right? An outlaw. So I've certainly lost his love, and I've lost my honor, and I've lost everything through this one, semi-accident. Nor look upon the faces of any I love again, which shows. Maybe he didn't get love easily, but he does seem to give love, right? He speaks as if there are many people there in the house of Tynwelint whom he loves, and now he won't be able to see any of them again. And he doesn't dare to go to Hithlum. He doesn't dare to go home for two reasons. Again, these reasons are not given in the later version of the story, as Christopher points out. He's ashamed. He doesn't want to face his mom because he fears that his mother will be bitterly grieved at his disgrace. To come back like, you sent me to the king for fostering, and he took me in and loved me, and then I killed a man in his hall, and now I'm a murderer and an outlaw, and I have to come home, right? He doesn't dare to face his mom for shit. So now it's like, on top of this, he's lost his mother again. Right? Now, he was geographically removed from her, but now he's, in his own mind, infinitely removed from her. Now, he can't say, even if she were to come, he would have to avoid her, right? Because he can't bear to look on her for shame. And even notice the assumptions that he makes about Tynwelint, right? Perchance he might draw the wrath of the elves behind him to his folk. He can't go back to his mom's, not only because of the shame, but because he's so convinced that he did wrong and that he's lost the love of Tynwelint, that he believes the elves are going to pursue him in arms, and he doesn't dare go back for fear of drawing an avenging elvish army after him to pursue him into Hithlum. It's pretty awful. So, we got confession time. Carita's confessing that in a fit of temper she once threw a soda can at her brother's head once, but didn't kill him. See, Carita, now imagine if you'd thrown your soda can at your brother's head and he died from it. Imagine what, man. Yeah. And I bet Orgoff had it coming worse than your brother did. But still, and of course his own tears, right? As he is weeping for this, I feel that passages like this, especially in the context of that description of his life and outlook in Doriath before, I find, as a reader, this recruits my sympathies to Turin's side much more powerfully than almost anything that we get in the later versions of the story. This is a guy who, this speech shows the tenderness of his own heart, right? He's not leaving Artenor out of arrogance or out of pride, out of it's out of mistaken he draws the wrong conclusion. But it's a very understandable conclusion, and it's anyway, it's very sad. But and I love the sort of the metaphor. The metaphor. He's got the spilled wine on his hand that he has to wash off. Right, it's like blood on his hand, and he is clearly seeing it as sort of a symbol, right, that he now has blood on his hands, and he goes out and tries to wash it off. But it isn't really blood, right? It's wine, and he's not. Likewise, he's not guilty of murder, right? He's actually overreacting to this. And the terrible, terrible tragedy is that his own really, really sad conclusions about his state and how he's now destroyed his whole life are actually inaccurate. Ethan Pyle says it really well. Ethan says he's trying harder in this version, which makes his failures that much more lamentable. Will all great almost ocean wash this wine clean from my hand, says Sarah King. Exactly, yeah. He's not quite channeling Macbeth to that extent, but is he going olive great almost ocean to Incarnadine? I don't think so. Not with the wine anyway. Arthur says, I have a teenager, and some of this reminds me of the unending drama that is the teenage life. Yeah, and perhaps this is uncharitable in me, Arthur. But of course, Tolkien, when writing this, was a heck of a lot closer to that himself, right? I mean, remember, Tolkien was 25, maybe, when he wrote this? 26? I mean, he's right around like mid-20s when he wrote this. Teenage drama was not so far behind him at that point. I'm not... Those of you in your mid-20s, I'm not casting aspersions, I'm just saying that Tolkien, when he wrote this story, was closer to his own teenage years than either Arthur or I am. That's all I'm saying. And it's kind of interesting that he seems to... he sort of seems more in touch with that point of view. Mary Rose Minnick says, I can't stop thinking of that Charlie Brown quote, everything I touch gets ruined. So now I'll forever think of Turin as the Charlie Brown of the Lost Tales. Sort of. Slightly more violent than Charlie Brown. But yeah, something like that. Yeah, cool. Okay. When he finds, moving on from here to his next tragedy. So he leaves. Now remember, again, in the published Silmarillion, remember, this is the first time he changes his name. Okay. Bonus points. Who remembers his name, right? In the Silmarillion, what name does he take for himself when he leaves Doriath? And what does it mean? Good, yes. Nathan, the wronged, right? In the Silmarillion, Túrin leaves Doriath in a fit of pique is not a fair way to describe it, but he believes he has been wronged, right? He knows that he is not guilty of the death of Cyrus, right? That, like in the original version, he kind of is the cause of it, but he wasn't trying to kill him, and it was it wasn't nearly as bad as it looked, right? In the Silmarillion version, Maglor comes, or not Maglor, the heavy-handed dude. Oh my goodness, it's been a long day. Mablung, thank you. God, goodness, thank you everybody. Mablung comes in, and catches him right as Cyros is plunging naked into the cliff, and Turin's like, "I know this looks bad, right? It looks awful." He knows it's not as bad as it looks, but he won't go back and right. But not only does he refuses to stand trial, right? He sort of presumes that injustice is going to be done to him, right? If I go back to trial with you, I know I'm not going to get a fair shake, so I'm just going to leave under the assumption that I'm being and then, of course, he is acquitted, in fact, right? Even in absentia, he's acquitted. So Thingol is left to send his pardon after him. There's no wronged here, right? He doesn't leave with that sense. He doesn't go off on the beginning of his travels here with that sense of, now I am an outlaw, and now I am... he calls himself an outlaw, but again, in shame, right? He feels himself to be guilty and unworthy to remain, not that he has been wronged, right, by the injustice of the king. Good, yes, Sarah, it does sound like he's punishing himself by leaving. Absolutely, I agree with that. He does blame himself more. And James, I think it's a good distinction. In a sense, he's doing the same thing, right? He doesn't stay for the trial, or else he would know that he would have been pardoned. But James says that what he's doing here, it feels more like ignorance than pride. It's very much pride in the later version. He's not leaving arrogantly. He's leaving in shame and self-recrimination. So let's move on to the next horrible phase of Turin's life, the Beleg incident. Yet Turin, in unhappiness, believing the hand of all against him and the heart of the king become that of a foe, crept to the uttermost bounds of that woodland realm. There he hunted for his subsistence, being a good shot with the bow, for his subsistence. Yet he rivaled not the elves at that, for rather at the wielding of the sword was he mightier than they. To him gathered a few wild spirits, and amongst them was Beleg the huntsman, who had rescued Gumlin and Turin in the woods aforetime. Now in many adventures were those twain together, Beleg the elf and Turin the man, which are not now told or remembered, but which once were sung in many a place. Okay, so we have now Turin and his outlaw band, which is way less shady in this version of the story, right? This feels sort of refreshing compared to, Turin the thug outlaw chieftain that we get in the later story. There's an air in the later version which is almost like Turin saying, well, if I'm going to be considered, a murderer and a horrible person by, the people of Doriath, I might as well become one. I mean, it's not exactly how it works, but it's almost like that. We don't get that here at all, right? He flees, again, believing in unhappiness, believing everyone's hand was against him and that the heart of the king was that of a foe. We see him crept to the uttermost bounds of that woodland realm. Notice how much less brash that sounds, how much more pitiable, right? He's creeping to the utter, but he doesn't even leave the woodland realm, right? He can't bear to go, but he can't stay because he believes the heart of the king has become that of a foe, but he can't bear to leave either, so he just creeps out to the uttermost bounds and hunts for his subsistence. And some people around there join him. They're wild spirits, not brigands, as Nick Marazzo says. And he and Beleg take part in many adventures. Doesn't this sound... This sounds very this sounds very, very Robin Hoodish to me, right? Turin and Beleg were never, but this doesn't this sound like, Beleg the elf, Turin the man, and their band of merry men, off in the woods, hunting for their subsistence, killing the king's deer. There's something kind of. I'm not saying that Tolkien is overtly modeling this on Robin Hood or anything like that, but it's more of that kind of this again. Them and a few wild spirits, right, having adventures. He's gone in unhappiness, and yet he's now carved out this like little time of happiness. Notice they're not accomplishing great deeds, right? They are not, as in the later versions of the story, becoming mighty captains in the entire area and turning back, the forces of Melkor. We don't have that, right? We don't have... very notably absent from the later edition is any parallel to the Dragon Helm, right? There's no sense of Túrin taking up, or maybe not being willing to take up, sort of, the mantle of, a leader among men. This is more personal, I think is what I want to say. That is what we see here is like Túrin recuperating his own life, right? He's not lost everything, because he still has Beleg the huntsman, who himself seems to have a much lesser position as far as externally. He's still important in the story, but does not seem to be quite so important in the court of Thingol, or Tynwelint, as Beleg Strongbow is in the later version. But again, for one who got not love easily, and who felt that he would never again see the face of any whom he loved, to find that a few, daring wild spirits have joined with him and banded with him, and most notably, his friend and former rescuer Beleg, is lovely, right? I mean, it's he's left in unhappiness, and yet now he's found, if not joy in the same way as before, is sort of making another life, which is, if not heroic, at least not dishonorable, and yet it is somewhat heroic. Again, it's not given any of that kind of stature of, having continental historic significance, but many songs are sung about the deeds that were done by Beleg and Túrin, nevertheless. But that doesn't end well, as we'll get to. Túrin and Beleg are attacked by orcs. Right, none of the business with Mime, no betrayal. They're just attacked by a larger than usual band of orcs. All were there slain, save Túrin and Beleg escaped with wounds, but Túrin was overborne and bound. For such was the will of Melko, that he be brought to him alive. For behold, dwelling in the... Now, hang on to this, because this I find especially interesting here. For such was the will of Melko, that he be brought to him alive. For behold, dwelling in the halls of Linwë, about which had that fay Gwetheling, the queen, woven much magic and mystery, and such power of spells as can come only from Valinor, whence indeed, long time agone, she once had brought them. Now, in the syntax of this sentence, it can be kind of hard to trace where we're going. Túrin had been lost out of his sight. Okay, let me go back syntactically a little bit here. For behold, dwelling in the halls of Linwë, Túrin had been lost out of his sight, out of Melko's sight. And he, Melko, feared lest he, Túrin, cheat the doom that was devised for him. Therefore now he purposed to entreat him grievously before the eyes of Urin. But Urin had called upon the valor of the West. Okay, hang on, we'll come back to that. See what just happened there? While Túrin was in Artenor, while he was with Tynwelint and Gwetheling, or Gwendoling, while he was in Artenor, he was out of the sight of Melko, and at risk of, had the chance of cheating the doom that Melko had devised for him. Do you see what that means? Go back. All right, I'll go back a little bit here. Go back to Turin's unhappiness here, right? All this stuff, right? Fortune did not follow him, for few things that he desired greatly came to him, and many things at which he labored went awry. When we're reading that, we're probably thinking, well, yeah, dude got cursed by Melko, right? Melko said it's going to be, his life is going to be miserable, and I'm going to make sure everything's awful. And it sounds like, okay, see, look, here's the curse of Melko bearing fruit. No. Apparently not, in fact. While all this stuff is going on, while fortune is not following him, and his, the things at which he's laboring are going awry, he's cloaked from the sight of Melko. In fact, the whole reason Melko has him captured and brought back is because he wants to start beating on him, right? Because he thinks, that Túrin chap has escaped from unhappiness scot-free to this point, right? I better start the suffering, or else I'm going to disappoint Urin, right? I told Urin I was going to make his son suffer, and I haven't delivered on that yet, right? So I gotta bring him back over here so that I can do some really inflict some really concentrated suffering on this Túrin chap, right? Isn't that interesting? The unhappiness of Túrin. He's already said, I feel like there's a curse on me. Again, when he says that, right? Is there a curse on me? Right? And we're all like, dude, yeah, there is, right? Except, yes and no, right? Apparently, the curse wasn't affecting him. So, yeah, exactly, Sarah. The accidental killing doesn't seem to be Melko's fault. Fascinating, isn't that? Now, let's go back to the passage, which I didn't finish there. So, okay. So we get that bit. Then, okay, he's purposing to treat him grievously. I'm going to bring it back, and I'm going to start inflicting some suffering at last on this Túrin guy. But Urin had called, but, I love the preposition at the beginning, but, to counterbalance that intention by Melko to inflict suffering upon Túrin, Urin had called upon the Valar of the West, being taught much concerning them by the Eldar of Kor, the gnomes he had encountered, and his words came, who shall say how, to Manwe Sulamo upon the heights of Taniquetil, the mountain of the world. Nonetheless, was Túrin dragged now many an evil league in sore distress, a captive of the pitiless orcs. Okay. Urin had called upon the Valar, and were explicitly told his words came to Manwe Sulamo upon the heights of Taniquetil. He was petitioning for his son, for Túrin, to Manwe, and Manwe heard him. Nonetheless, was Túrin dragged now many an evil league in sore distress, a captive of the pitiless orcs. Okay. Let's keep going. We'll come back to this. Yeah, Tom Hillman says sometimes the answer to a prayer is no. Yes, that would seem to be one of these times. But let's keep going. Noldoli too there were, who were under the evil enchantments of Melko, and wandered as in a dream of fear, doing his ill bidding, for the spell of bottomless dread was on them, and they felt the eyes of Melko burn them from afar. I love that the spell of bottomless dread. This is one of there are a bunch of phrases that Tolkien uses in the Book of Lost Tales, which I find just really resonant with mythic significance. Just a phrase all by itself. Dreamer in the Tower of Pearl is one. A spell of bottomless dread is another. Love it. Anyways, they feel the eyes of Melko burn them from afar. Yet often did these sad elves, both thrall and free, hear the voice of Ulmo in the streams, or by the sea marge, where the waters of Sirion mingled with the waves. For Ulmo, of all the Valar, still thought of them most tenderly, and designed with their slender aid to bring Melko's evil to ruin. Then, remembering the blessedness of Valinor, would they at times cast away their fear, doing good deeds, and aiding both elves and men against the Lord of Iron. Okay, so we're told A, Urin is petitioning to Manwë, who is hearing him. We're told B, that Olmo is still paying attention to what's going on here in the Great Lands, that his voice can still be heard on the shores and in the streams, and which often has a very concrete and positive effect for good, right? We've got these description of these elves who are pulled out of the bottomless dread of the spell of Melko. The burning eyes of Melko, and regain hope and become agents of good, almost agents to bring Melko's evil to ruin, right? Even though their aid may be slender towards that end, yet nevertheless, that's the end that they're working to with Olmo's help. All right. Then in the transition here is the one that blows my mind. Now was it that it came to the heart of Beleg, the hunter of the elves, to seek after Turin, so soon as his own hurts were healed. Now was it that it came into the heart of Beleg the hunter. It doesn't explicitly say that Olmo whispered to him that he should go and rescue Turin. But the juxtaposition of these things, having just given us this long paragraph about how the whispering voice of Olmo comes up through the streams and suggests these actions, these good deeds, to strike a blow against the evil of Melko and puts them into the hearts of despairing elves. Now, having said that, I'll mention that it somehow came into the heart of Beleg the hunter to seek Turin. Just to clarify, these are the elves that have been taken by Melkor and have been damaged by him. They have been bound with the spell of bottomless dread. So these are Noldoli, as it says, the waiter Noldor, and they're serving Melko, sort of serving Melko. These are the precursors of those escaped thralls who are distrusted by the other elves in the Silmarillion tradition, because they've been they are still under Melkor's sway. They're not really, they're loose but not really free. And Yana says, doesn't this almost make them like orcs? Yes, it does make them like orcs. They're not orcs exactly, but there does seem to be some similarity there. Nick asked, did they actually do evil deeds for Melko? Yes, some did. That's what it sounds like. It says that they do his ill bidding. Yeah. So again, even in the later version, we still see echoes of this, and that people, the other elves, suspected them, and their suspicions weren't always untrue, right? He's a little stronger in the earlier versions to say that they are actually wandering as in a dream of fear, doing Melko's ill bidding. They're not really in their right minds. They're wandering as in a dream of fear, right? It's not like they are active servants or in sort of willing collusion with Melko, but they're enchanted. They're under the spell of bottomless dread. So Arthur's asking, did this thought come into the heart of Beleg from Melko? No, I think it sounds like it came from Olmo, which on the one hand, again, sounds like the kind of thing Olmo would say, right? Rescue your friend, resist the will of Melko, prevent Turin from being brought alive into Melko's clutches and tortured before his father. Yeah, that sounds great. except for how it turns out. And there's Manwë not paying a lick of attention to his dad either. That's exactly what I find so interesting about it. Yeah. Yeah, Roy says, this is another reason why this story is told so frequently. The Valar and men have a strained relationship. Yeah. Certainly the ways of the Valar are very much more mysterious to men than to the elves. And I agree, right? This story shows that really clearly. Yeah. The death of Beleg. That whole scene, of course, is very similar. It doesn't change all that much. Even the details of it don't change all that much from the early version to the later version. Excuse me. But I, at the same time, the main thing, I don't want to look at the passage mostly because it's so horrible. The death of Beleg I find more painful than anything else in the Túrin Turambar story. And I find again this version even more sad because of to me the primary difference between the way that the death of Beleg is described in this version compared to the later version is the detail. The whole thing is sort of passed over in summary. That is, you couldn't dramatize it, right? Based on the action cues that are given to you. In the Silmarillion version, we get the business about like the pricking of his foot, right? How he's accidentally, stabbed by the sword, gouged by the sword, and wakes up and wrests the sword from him, and then in the Silmarillion just says, and slew Beleg Cuthalion, right? This is a very sort of bald statement that this is the horrible thing that happened, and then in the flash of lightning he sees his face. Here we get his words, we get his actions, right? And the whole thing, it makes it, not only does it make it so much more vivid and so much easier to picture, right? I mean, it's so much easier for us to imaginatively invest ourselves in this scene and, kind of imaginatively come alongside Túrin, both in waking up and believing himself tortured, and then sort of seeing how he acted. Christopher Tolkien is good on this point in his analysis in the notes at the end, that we are sort of given the physical explanation for why the tragedy happened. That is, why was Beleg not able to call, when Túrin woke up, why didn't Beleg immediately yell, say, Túrin, it's me, it's me, it's me? Why doesn't he say that? Because he can't, right? Because the very first thing that Túrin does is knock the wind out of him. So poor Beleg can't speak. He's there like gasping for breath and trying to cry out and can't until Túrin half severs his throat. So, like, first he's got the breath, the wind knocked out of him, and then he gets his windpipe severed. So and so both the horrible image, the way we're invited to picture it so much more vividly, right, with the wound in the neck, and this, that idea of, Beleg, sort of thrashing desperately for, trying to get breath to tell Túrin who he is, and then getting stabbed in the throat. It's just so awful. And again, in the context of this story, this has still been the story. Arthur, I come back to the point that you made earlier on about, this is the story of Turin's abandonment issues, how much more prominent those are. The story of the boy who was separated from his mother and has grown up loved by so few. And and then he has that, there's the terrible accident with the drinking vessel, and he believes that he's lost everyone that he loved, except, as we said, but Beleg comes with him, right? He hasn't lost everybody. He still has his band of merry men and his one friend who stuck with him, and now he's killed him. And it's there's a way in which the killing of Beleg in the later version is even worse in like a bigger picture sense, right? Beleg is so devoted to Turin, so humbly devoted to Turin, that is, he comes down from his station, he leaves behind his place, he gives up everything to follow Turin in love for him, and to bring, he really, Beleg in the later Silmarillion version really has devoted his life to trying to rescue Turin. So in that sense, it's sort of a greater, bigger, sort of more horrible, more grandiosely horrible tragedy when Turin accidentally kills him. But the personal tragedy of this hits even, okay, it's like, no, now if he thought he was alone, if he was weeping, thinking he was alone with the wine on his hands back, at the stream outside the halls of Tynwillt, what a terrible foreshadowing that turned out to be, of now he has blood on his hands, and it's his best friend's blood, under so much more horrible circumstances, and now he has lost everyone who loved him, and it's just also it's more awful. I find it's more awful in the sense that, again, I feel much worse for Turin himself. My sympathy is so much more with Turin here than it is in the later versions. Moving on to his time with the Rodolflin. There are two scenes I really want to look at there before we get to his final name change, or I should say, till we get finally to his name change. Of course, you will notice that he, somewhat refreshingly, I'm sure, to many readers, changes his name so much less frequently in the older version than he does in the later versions. When he goes to Orodreth, he gets, sort of a new name. He gets a new identity. Let's look at this passage here. Now, despite the wisdom of their wisest, such bitter words confused their counsels and delayed. This is Turin saying about how they shouldn't hide, how they should fight openly. And there were no few of the stout-hearted that found hope in them, being sad at the thought of abandoning those places where they had begun to make an abiding place of peace and goodliness. But Turin begged Orodreth for a sword, and he had not wielded a sword since the slaying of Beleg, but rather had he been contented with a mighty club. Now then Orodreth let fashion for him a great sword, and it was made by magic to be utterly black, save at its edges, and those were shining bright and sharp as but gnome steel may be. Heavy it was, and was sheathed in black, and it hung from a sable belt, and Turin named it Gurtholfin, the wand of death. And often that blade leapt in his hand of its own lust, and it is said that at times it spake dark words to him. Therewith did he now range the hills, and slew unceasingly, so that Black Sword of the Rodolflim became a name of terror to the orcs. And for a great season all evil was fended from the caverns of the gnomes. Hence comes that name of Turin's among the gnomes, calling him Mormagli, or Mormakil, according to their speech, for these names signify Black Sword. what I would point out, what really jumps out at me in this passage, is the, in my mind, somewhat ambivalent place that this gives, or sort of ambivalent status this gives to Turin's role in the fall of the Rodothlem in this story. Again, in the later version, we have Turin. Remember when Glaurung in the later story is trying to make Turin feel bad about himself. He calls him a counselor foolhardy, right? It's very clear in the later story that Turin's counsel is wrong. We know it's wrong. Olmo told Finrod, right, to hide himself away, and revealed to him the caverns where Nargothrond was built. Turin is at first implicitly opposing the word of Olmo in telling them to abandon the secrecy that Finrod led them into and taking them there in the first place. But then, of course, he is explicitly rejecting the advice of Olmo when those messengers from Olmo show up and say, don't do this, throw the bridge down, stop what you're doing, and Turin says, heck no, we're not doing that, right? So again, it's clear that he is determined, right, that this is how things are going to go, and it's not a great idea, but it leads to destruction, and so it's pretty clear in the later story that the downfall of Nargothrond is pretty squarely Turin's fault. Now, maybe it would have fallen eventually, but nevertheless, it's his fault that it fell. I think that is a great deal less clear in the early version. And one of the things, this passage really jumped out at me in that way. The sword, the black sword, is given... So on the one hand, Orodreth is saying, the way we do things here among the Rodothlem is to hide, right? And we strike from secrecy, and we don't let anyone know where we live. That's who we are, that's what we do, right? And Turin's like, actually, no, I think we should fight openly. And Orodreth makes him his sword, right? The black sword of Nargothrond, again in the later versions, that is the identity. That identity is part of that identity. A central part of that identity of the Mormogil is that rash counselor, right? That one who undid Nargothrond. The Mormogil, in the end, was the death, not only personally of Orodreth, but of all of Nargothrond. And he brought that sword with him there, right? It was reforged there, but he brought it with him. All of the things which lead him to make the decisions that he does are things that he imports, right? The sword is made for him there and given to him there, and it's dodgy, right? This wand of death. They make him a really awesome sword and everything, which is kind of cool, but it's a pretty questionable thing that they give him, right? It spake dark words to him, and the blade sometimes leaps in his hand of its own lust. Of its own lust, remember we talked about lust. It means of its own desire, right? It's the sword just sometimes draws itself, right? There's Turin minding his own business, when all of a sudden, whoop, the sword leaps out of its sheath into his hand, right? Again, it's like this is almost acting like an external force on him, right? I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I think that element is there. It's not part of him. It's given to him by the elves, and then they name him after it, right? All that stuff doesn't come from... It's not a reflection of Turin's policies. It's not a reflection of... it's connected with his policies. He asks for a sword so that he can fight openly, as he's argued he should. So it's connected there, but that's why I use the word ambivalent at the beginning. It pushes both ways, I think. It's harder to see that this is... it's harder for me to see that this is clearly the downfall of the Rodolphum is entirely Turin's fault, and he should have known better, and he had warnings, and he disregarded them. A couple of you are arguing that swords don't go whoop. I don't know, but I think that the wand of death might have whooped sometimes. We'll come back to the whooping of the sword next time. Needless to say, I'm going to want to talk about the final speech of the sword, and some comparing and contrasting of the last words of Turin's sword. I think are extremely revealing in these two stories. Yeah. So there seems to me, maybe the Rodolphum don't like to fight this way, but this kind of fight is in them. This kind of, that they're the ones generating the black, morally sketchy, bloodthirsty, violence-inducing swords here, and giving them to Turin, which leads them to assign him this name. They name him after the sword that they make for him and give to him. And that seems to me to really change the dynamics of what goes on with him and the Rodolphum. Another thing which, again, really, for me, changes the dynamics of the end of the story of the Rodolphum is after the battle. What happens, especially with Fælivren, the girl. Then, leaving Lord Orodreth dead, Turin went to the places of Galweg's abiding, that is, her dad. And there was Fælivren, weeping bitterly at the tidings of her father's death, but Turin sought to comfort her, for the pain of her heart and the sorrow of her father's death, and of the ruin of her folk, she swooned upon his breast, and cast her arms about him. So deep was the ruth of Turin's heart, that in that hour he deemed he loved her very dearly. Yet were now he and Flinding alone, save for a few aged carles and dying men, and the orcs, having despoiled the field of dead, were nigh upon them. Thus stood Turin before the doors with Gurtholfin in hand, and Flinding was beside him, and the orcs fell on that place and ransacked it utterly, dragging out all the folk that lurked therein and all their goods, whatsoever great or little worth there might there lie hid. But Turin denied the entrance of Galweg's dwelling to them, and they fell thick about him, until a company of their archers, standing at a distance, shot a cloud of arrows at him. Now he wore chainmail such as all the warriors of the gnomes have ever loved, and still do wear. Yet it turned not all those ill shafts, and already was he sore hurt, when Flinding fell, pierced suddenly through the eye. And soon, too, he had met his death, and his weird had been the happier thereby, had not that great drake, coming now upon the sack, bidden them cease their shooting. But with the power of his breath he drove Turin from those doors, and with the magic of his eyes he bound him hand and foot. In the later version, Turin leads the army out into the battle where they're destroyed. He sort of fails twice. He sort of fails as a general strategically, fails as a general tactically, is defeated on the battlefield, leaves the battlefield where his men are being slaughtered, which is usually not counted as one of Turin's very bad deeds, but it's not a very good deed either, and comes back when it's far too late to Nargothrond. Here, he doesn't come back when it's quite too late, but it's almost too late. It's certainly too late for him to succeed in doing anything, although he almost manages successfully to give his life defending Fælivren, which as the narrator tells us, his weird would have been happier had he done so. His weird just means his fate, his destiny. That word, weird, comes directly from the old Anglo-Saxon word weird, W-Y-R-D, which means fate, destiny, doom. Those who was it just asking about doom? Mark Ingram was asking about that. Weird and doom, yeah, they're very, very, very similar. But he doesn't just come back to where the dragon is already ruling, over the captives. He comes back in time to stand between Fáilífrinn and the enemy, and make a wall of slain in front of the door of her house, of her dead father's house, and almost sacrifice his life standing in the doorway. This is not exactly a cheerful ending of the story, but it's how many northern heroes end their stories, being finally torn down or shot from a distance as they stand over a heap of corpses that they have made in front of the door of the building that they are, without true hope of victory, defending with to their last breath. It's a way to go. It's a pretty heroic way to go. Not a happy ending, but a satisfying ending in a sense. And then you get that beautiful but kind of awful in its way moment of his realization now. Oh, wait, maybe I could love her, right? So deep was the ruth, the pity, the sorrow of Túrin's heart that in that hour he deemed he loved her very dearly. Now he's thinking, oh yeah, actually I do love her dearly, don't I? Again, almost too late. Yeah, Matthew says it worked for Boromir. Exactly. And he came this close to Boromir's death, right? Orc arrows from a distance. I mean, he almost had it all going there. And I think that, although it doesn't exactly make for a happy story, we could still say of Túrin, had he died of these orc arrows here, we could still say of Túrin, as Faramir says of Boromir, he died well, achieving some good thing, right? Yeah. So ends his brief, extremely brief, about 5 minute long love affair with Fáilífrinn, and his attempt to give his life heroically, thwarted by the dragon. I gotta let you go soon, but let's look at the dragon and his name change. Wonderest thou not wherefore I have withheld death from thee, O Túrin Mormakil, who wast once named brave? Then Túrin remembered all his griefs, and the evil that had fallen upon him, and he said, Taunt me not, foul worm, for thou knowest I would die, and for that alone methinks thou slayest me not. But the drake answered, saying, Know then this, O Túrin, son of Urin, that a fate of evil is woven about thee, and thou mayst not untangle thy footsteps from it whithersoever thou goest. Yea, indeed, I would not have thee slain, for thus wouldst thou escape very bitter sorrows, and a weird of anguish. Then Túrin, leaping suddenly to his feet, and avoiding that beast's baleful eye, raised aloft his sword, and cried, Nay, from this hour none shall name me Túrin if I live. Behold, I will name me a new name, and it shall be Turambar. Now this meaneth conqueror of fate, and the form of the name in the gnome speech is Turumart. Then, uttering these words, he made a second time at the drake, thinking indeed to force the drake to slay him, and to conquer his fate by death. But the dragon laughed, saying, Thou fool, and I would I had slain thee long since, and could do so here and now, and if thou And if I will, thou... and if I will not, thou canst not do battle with me waking, for my eye can cast once more the binding spell upon thee, that thou stand as stone. Nay, get thee gone, O Turambar, conqueror of fate. First thou must meet thy doom, and thou wouldst o'ercome it. Notice, this is to me one of the most striking differences between the Turin that we meet in this story and the Turin that we meet later on. What he means by the name Turambar, right? Those are the only two names that he shares in common between the two stories, Turin and Turambar. But what he means by it is very different, right? What does he mean in this version? Why does he call himself Turambar? Why does he call himself Turambar? How's he going to conquer fate? Yes, by death. By death. That is what... It's not a boast, right? He doesn't call himself Turambar in the Silmarillion or in the Narn, in the later story. Whether you read it in Unfinished Tales, whether you read it in the Silmarillion, whether you read it in the Children of Oren, wherever you read it, when does he name himself Turambar? Do you remember? When later Turin names himself Turambar? When does he call him? At what point in his career does he take to himself the name Turambar? Yes, James, when he thinks he's escaped, right, with the woodmen. Yes, exactly. When he has retired, he's in Brethil, and everything's going well, and he's made a new life for himself among the woodmen, and he's even found this beautiful wife in the woods and everything, right? And so he's like, I've escaped my doom, right? I won. Call me Turambar, right? And of course, like, the readers know, like, he's marrying his sister even now, and it's like, oh, that's so awful, the horrible irony. But it's arrogance, right? I mean, as so often in the later Turin story, it's his pride, which is leading to that. This isn't pride, right? When he calls himself Turambar, he is going to conquer his doom by dying here. When he talks about escaping his fate, I'm pausing as I so often do before I utter a sentence that contains the word always or never. But I think this is true. In this version of the story, in the early story, every time Turin talks about conquering fate or conquering his doom, he's talking about death. He's talking about his own death. That's how he's going to conquer fate. Not by escaping it, not by triumphing over it, but and that's indeed how where Gloran seems to be taunting him there at the end, right? First thou must meet thy doom, and thou wouldst o'ercome it, right? Oh, hey, no, live up to your name, right? O conqueror of fate, right? Go out there and meet your doom and beat it, man. Yeah, go do that. That's what you should do, right? That's Gloran's, of course, twisted and malicious advice. But he... So, I mean, he's not meeting his doom, because to meet his doom is to suffer from it, right? The way that he can escape is through death. Yes, Nancy, that's what I meant in the title. I was actually, when I was reading it this last time, I couldn't remember whether the word Fey ever came up, and I kept expecting it to, because Turin is like technically Fey for a great big portion of this story, but I didn't catch it. I don't think he ever does. Tolkien never does use the word Fey in this story. But being as one going willingly to death is what Fey means, but that's for Turin. For this Turin, for our Book of Lost Tales Turin, that's what it means to be Turambar. And his death here, the death that he is seeking, he's been seeking death, right? He was just seeking death in the doorway of Galweg's house. He's now seeking death at the teeth of the dragon, right? But again, both times, he's seeking death, but he's seeking to die well, right? I'm going to attack the dragon, and assuming that the dragon's going to kill him. Combining this with the other things that we've seen in the life of young Turin here in this earlier story. His sadness, his loneliness, his loss, and then much more horrible loss again of everyone that he loved, his exile through, sort of self-recrimination and shame, first for the accidental death of what's his name? The guy whose name is not Cyrus, or what was it, Orlog, or I'm going back to look it up. I can never. Orgoth. That's right, Orgoth. So first by the accidental death of Orgoth, and then by the horrible accidental death of Beleg, and now. Again, unlike in the other version, he seemed to be like really wanting to do the right thing here and to help the Rodolphlim, and they embrace his, advice and rationale, it seems, in ways far more profound. It's not a question of him, by the power and force of his own personality, overcoming the caution and wisdom of the elves of Nargothrond. No, here the Rodolphlim, they're willing, in fact many of them are quite happy to go along with him. It doesn't turn out to be the right thing, and Orodreth dies, and they're all conquered, but he's still trying to sell his life dearly and accepting his own death, right? Here again, for the third time he's going to lose everything that he loves and cares about. Again, this is not... The Silmarillion version always gives me the sense of, like, let us watch Turin, blow things in, like, more and more spectacular and dramatic ways. Let me screw everything up even more colossally next time. But I don't get that impression at all in this story. That doesn't seem to be the way this story goes. Rather, it's his own world, like him trying to find a place, him trying to find a people, him trying to, do something, to do something right and to do good, and it falling apart again. Even though again he does kill or Fog, or whatever his name is. He does kill him, and that's bad. And he does kill Beleg, and he does, give the bad advice about fighting openly. But in none of those does he really seem as culpable. Rather, he seems more like the victim. The victim of the unhappiness which is following him. And now being manipulated and actively twisted by the dragon. Interesting. Mark. Mark says he was searching the Kindle version for the word Fae, and it only shows up once in the entire book, and it's in the appendix of names under Turambar. Okay, I have to see this, Mark. I didn't notice that at all. I wasn't looking at the appendix. Let's see. Let's see if my page numbers are the same. Yeah. Okay, appendix of names. Turambar. For the first element, see volume 1 260, Merrill E. Turinki. So the T-U-R in Turinki is the same as in Turambar. That's interesting. QL gives a Marto Embar fate, and also root Mart, a piece of luck. Marto, fortune, fate, lot, Mart, it happens. GL has Mart, fate, Martion, fated, doomed, Fae. Also Umrad and Umbart, fate. Fated, doomed, Fae. There it is, Mark. Interesting. So fated, doomed, Fae. So it's suggesting a play, essentially, within his name. Master of Fate, but also doomed, Fae. Interesting. And it looks like that's the Turumart version. This is all under the Marto Mart portion of the name description. So it sounds like it's talking about the gnome version. Very interesting. James Lebeck asks, so is that why this tale is such a favorite? Because it's so tragic? Then maybe we find the later story less appealing because Tolkien made Turin more conflicted, willful, and proud. Certainly. I mean, I think there's, in my mind anyway, there's no question that Turin is a much more attractive character in this one, and therefore his story is more emotionally powerful. It's awful in the later versions. But again, I don't feel my sympathies rallied nearly as intensely on his side as in these. Good Ethan says, even more strongly, in the Silmarillion version, my sympathies lie with those whose lives he's ruining. In this version, my sympathy lies much more with Turin. Very good. And Sarah says he seems a lot less self-important and conscious of his own greatness in this version than in the later version. Yeah, I mean, it is much easier. I'm not saying that this is a full and satisfying reading of Turin's character. You know, that he's always like this, and this is the most important thing. But he. He's like the kid who wants to do right but keeps screwing up, right? That's more what he's like. So I mean, thinking about the bigger pictures as we were discussing at the beginning about why this is a favorite and why this is a favorite of men in general, and why this story seems to be so tied to not the fate of men, but sort of the perception of the human condition, and that sense of generally well-intentioned, talented, well-intentioned, but unfortunate, sad, and just dealt a really terrible hand. Does seem to speak in much more compelling ways. I certainly think it's easier to see how this version of the story would be a bit more of a favorite, but we'll see. So, I'm gonna stop here. We didn't quite get as far as I wanted to get, but not too bad. So we'll pick up here next time. We're going to go through the end of the story. there's a lot to talk about next week, but I hope since we've done a lot of groundwork laying this week, I'm sure I'll be much more efficient next week. But anyway, thanks everybody for joining me tonight, and I look forward to finishing the end of the story. We'll get to the incest and suicide and everything next time, so won't that be fun? Good night, everybody. See you next week. Bye.